Welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for social justice and collective liberation. I'm Damien.
And I'm Aaron. Thank you so much for joining us today.
For those new to our podcast, Interdependent Study is meant to be a space and community for folks who believe in and want to do the work for social justice.
Absolutely. Each week, we're going to bring something new to the table, as we have been doing, and we're going to discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
That's right. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Aaron, my friend, you're up this week. What have you brought to the table today?
I brought my new voice. This is what I sound like now. We went to an amusement park over the weekend.
Hershey Park.
And I screamed my head off on roller coasters.
Lots of them.
And this is what happened to me.
We'll make it
that with probably not staying hydrated enough. And trying to talk over just the ambient loudness of a theme park. This is not what I sound like. So
docile tones by Aaron.
We'll see if it continues or if it heals up in the next few days. Well, we'll find out.
All right.
But what I'm actually bringing is an article from The Forge. That's a really great summary written by Sandra Hinson. It's a summary of a panel discussion between 4 organizers. It's called "What Does It Look Like When We Build Our Power and Fight the Right?" So the 4 organizers who were in the conversation were Maurice Mitchell, who is the national director of the Working Families Party, Sindolo Diamina, who's the co-director of the Carolina Federation, Alexa Horwart, who is the lead organizer for Faith in Minnesota, and Brendan Walsh, who is the executive director of Worker Power. And so it was also moderated by Hashim Benford and Priya Johnson, both of whom are strategists from the Grassroots Power Project. The article finds some of the major lessons from this discussion and makes connections between what these organizers learned and how they can be translated to other settings. And they talk about working with the center, building from a position of strength, preparing for victories to bring blowback, and fostering progressive and left alignment, which are all really important things to consider as more people are thinking about how we beat back authoritarianism that is spreading across the country in state legislatures and in governor mansions and what have you. Great conversation to read and get some insight from. But what about you? What did you think? Where you want to start?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think you're right. There's a lot of applicability of a piece like this, right? Beyond the work that these folks are doing in their organizing spaces, right? There's a lot of individuals thinking about this work, right, and the work we need to do. And so I really appreciated this piece. I thought it was great. Really fascinating insight and knowledge from, some really well-established and accomplished organizers and really movement leaders in their own rights, and just a lot to learn from them and this piece, especially if you are an organizer or on the ground, right? Or as we just talked about, right, you're engaged politically at any level. So I enjoyed this. I certainly think the crux of the lessons here are, so applicable to all of us in our work, right? I think one of the biggest things that this piece really highlighted for me is how difficult this work is, right? Especially for folks who identify as progressives, right? In their thinking, in their politics. Like, there is so much head and heart work involved, right, in this, and there's so much to navigate, right? There are so many forces working with and against you at any given time, right, at the same time, and so it's important to have pieces like this, I think, to have this knowledge and insight to help organizers continue to learn and be reminded of how to build strong partnerships and alliances and across their work, right? And just sort of highlight the importance of this work. So that was one of the biggest things that stood out to me, I think, in this.
Yeah, and I think I like your analysis of that it's more difficult for progressives.
Yeah.
Because progressives have to build something against sort of frequently the natural, quote unquote, the way things have always been.
Yeah, it's the natural order.
It's not natural,
yes,
but the way things have always been. And that takes more work to get people in coalition and to get people sort of in a shared analysis, which is one of the things they talked about.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Yeah, that's really great. One of the things that I think one of the big learning pieces of this is something I don't think that progressive or leftist folks talk about much is working with centrists.
Yes.
Especially when it makes sense to align for a coalition around a campaign or something, a policy, something like that.
Yeah.
In the context of the Build Back Better legislation from 2021, progressives pushed the agenda to include things that are important to this kind of infrastructure legislation. So the article said, quote, Build Back Better transferred trillions of dollars from the federal government to state and local governments and then directly to people. One of the most significant transfers of resources down to the ground in more than 50 years. And it wouldn't have happened the same way if progressives weren't in coalition with centrist forces. And so that kind of distribution of resources is going to have long-lasting positive impact in communities across the country, and it just wouldn't have happened in the same way, as the article said, if progressives hadn't stayed at the table to continue to negotiate and to continue to push for the things that are important to them with an administration that is, for the most part, trying to position itself as pretty centrist.
Yes.
So
that's a key part of this too.
Yeah, and so my question thinking about that is, where can other things like this happen? The balance between sort of purity of values, and I'm not saying that people actually do this, but there's a perception that it happens, that there's a purity test for whether or not progressives are going to participate in something, whether that's individuals or organizations.
Yep.
And and it's sort of a balancing act of that and getting stuff done. And it's a tough one to strike because sometimes that if the values aren't in alignment, you can't sit at the table with those people because what they're pushing for is not something that you want, and
absolutely
they're not going to listen to you in that negotiation, right? So there's all of these levels of how it's difficult to strike that balance and figure out when is appropriate to be in coalition, when is not. Because sometimes it's clear and sometimes it's not clear. And like all of that. So, I really appreciated them talking about that kind of in the context of Build Back Better and that big infrastructure legislation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. The example of the Build Back Better legislation is huge, right? In the sense that, I mean, you talked about it being sort of this idea of trillions of dollars being sort of allocated from the federal government to do this work, right?
Yeah.
So it is huge. The reality is it's just this huge win, right? And this huge, what do you call it? What is the word I'm searching for? Sort of allocation of resources, right? To do some incredible work, right? That folks at the local level are fighting for. And so I think I'm so glad they included that example as this sort of like dream scenario, right? This huge victory in what this work could look like, right? What this work could lead to. And I think that sort of leads me into something else I wanted to share, which was just this idea of there's so many lessons from this piece that I think could be applicable to other organizations, right, and what they're trying to do, and there's a lot that other organizations could replicate from this, right, and do in their respective cities and their places of influence, right, and so in addition to Build Back Better, there was lots of examples in here, right? One example was the story of how the organization called Faith in Minnesota worked for over 18 months to build this coalition of people who would run in elections all around Minnesota, and how that work led to those folks feeling and being accountable to the organization and its mission, the work it was doing, its values, throughout the caucus process. Yeah. And then from there, their victories led them being able to influence the Minnesota Democratic Farmer Labor Party's endorsement for governor, right? And that all of that work has really meant that they've been able to have a say in budget negotiations for the state as well, right? And so, talking about Build Back Better is this sort of national big, example, right? But this is, an example from the state of Minnesota, right? And the work that can happen sort of at the local level. And it, I think, was a beautiful illustration of the power of organizing and more specifically, as this piece categorized it, right? The power of building strength both for and within your organization, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you have to play the long game, right? Like this was over 18 months of work, right? And so that takes a lot of conversations, right? Bringing folks to the table, getting folks aligned in a mission and in your vision, right? And that's a long time for people to be giving up their time and their energy outside of their normal everyday day-to-day lives to be focused on, right, this central mission of whatever we're trying to accomplish, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it takes and it takes that time, right? It's because it takes the time to build the relationships for people to trust each other and do all that, right? Like we talked about that last week, or the week before, I don't know, recently. Doing work at the speed of that makes sense.
Yes.
Yeah. So,
and we're also working within the time constraints. I mean, this is an example of elections, right? So you're also working at the pace of elections, right? And elections happen when they happen, right? And so part of that is natural, right? It takes time to do that work in sync with elections, but still, it takes time if you want to do it well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that was interesting to me was the experiences that organizers shared with the blowback they had after victories, because it points to the realities of conditions on the ground to a certain extent. They mentioned specifically the mayor race in Buffalo a few years back, where the Working Families Party joined a coalition to elect a progressive in the primary and I think push out the incumbent.
Yes.
But then they faced a huge backlash from the center of the voting bloc and the right, who joined together to basically have that progressive candidate lose.
Yep.
And the candidate that they pushed out ended up, I think, running on an independent ticket as a write-in candidate, and et cetera, et cetera. So all of these factors came together to work against them right after they had sort of accomplished the first step in that campaign. And, you know, in the context of all of that, it means that progress is a moving target.
Yes.
Right. And, you know, winning an election is one thing, governing is another. And Sandolo Diamina points out that governing means taking on the contradictions between your own values and other perspectives in your constituency. So it's learning to navigate those contradictions. It's crucial to do that to be successful in progressive governance. And we talk about this a lot here. I think it can't just be all about opposition. Right. It can't just be about tearing things down. There has to be a vision. There has to be the ability to build things up as well. So there has to be that vision for the future put forth that includes everyone and that everyone can see themselves in. Yes. Which means you have to communicate it effectively. You have to do all this work. You have to build trust with people. Yes. Who you know, for decades have been led to believe that progressives are, I don't know, what are the right-wing talking points now? Like evil doers and so like there's all kinds of wild things being said. So that's all part of the conditions too. Yeah, and the work that's necessary, right? Yeah. I love that. I love that piece about governing, right? And you're right. It takes all of that. And again, it also takes time, right? To build those relationships and do that work and to really understand the needs of your community to then be able to govern, right? And to stand by and enact the choices that you talked about, right? To do the work that's important, even when it's difficult, even when you're faced with, you know, inevitably there are crises after crises, right? There are things that pop up, right? But that work is so important, and it is based off of, and it's important to keep in mind the trust that you've built up within the folks who got you there and the folks you're representing. So I loved those lessons in this piece as well. I'm glad you brought them here. The other thing that stood out to me in this, I appreciated all the leaders sort of talking about, and I think the piece, if I remember correctly, it's been a minute since I've read this, it sort of ends in this, but this idea of sort of core values or practices that organizations should have, right, in place in order to sort of build capacity and an ability to do this work, right? And so those were things like integrity, accountability, honesty, shared analysis, and leadership development. And so all the leaders sort of talked about these practices in a lot of ways. They talked about
among lots of things, how important it is to be grounded in who you are, right, and in your mission, how it's important to bring your members along in the work, obviously, invite them to the table when you're doing that work, how it's important to continually and collectively analyze efforts, right, of the organization and the organization's mission, how it's important to develop your members and to do the head and heart work involved in that when you're doing that, right? That's important.
Yeah.
And that's really only a snapshot, right, of some of the just incredible wisdom that these leaders shared about their practices, about these practices, I should say. But there's just a wealth of wisdom in this piece that I think all organizers could learn a lot from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's that whole section that broke down a lot of that stuff, I think was really great.
Yes.
And think about when you invite people to do work with you, or to at least watch you do the work, then they also learn how to do it.
Yes.
And then they can join in, and like your capacity expands to be able to do more.
Absolutely. And it continues when you're gone.
Yeah.
Yes.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
So, all right, well, let's talk about how all of this applies to our day-to-day lives.
Okay.
What's our application for this week? Mine is pulled directly from the last section of the piece, which is called Why We Persist.
Yes.
It's a quotation from Sindolo Diamina from Carolina Federation. They said, "I have seen many of our members come back to our organization because developing capacity to honestly face our lives, courageously face our lives, and then be able to take actions that actually make sense is incredibly ennobling, enabling, and liberating for people. And they come back being like, I want more of that." And I think this right here is why we talk about application each week.
Yes.
Is like, what are the lessons we can take away from the book we read, the article we read, the documentary we watched, whatever it might be, and how do we sort of apply it to what our lives are? How do we use it to change something big or small in our lives moving forward? And I think that, when we can do that, there's so much, I don't know, I guess it's liberation. There's so much power that you feel even in yourself.
Yes.
And being able to make changes from things that you, learn. And that learning could be head work, could be heart work.
Yes.
There's also like the work you do with your hands is also important. So there's all of that. And I think that's this quotation, I think, is why is a great example of why we have included application in our podcast from the beginning.
Absolutely. Well, and I love that you name sort of this idea of it could be big or small, right?
Yeah.
Because all of it is important, right? All of it is helping us sort of, as you say, lead to liberation, right? Lead to this change that we want to see, right? And we know needs to happen, right? And so big or small, it's still important, right? And so, the end of this piece struck me in so many ways. So I love that you pulled that quote. I think there's a lot in this that is so applicable to us, but also to folks who are really knee deep and engaged in movement and organizing work. And so I also pulled my application from the end of this piece. It's really the last two sentences got me really good. So the conclusion, as you said, is all about how organizers persist in this work, right?
Yeah.
And so the last two sentences are this: the daily struggles people live with can create despair and desperation. If we don't have a practice of wrestling with things together, we may be selling ourselves and our members short, right? And so I think, to me, that says it all, right? And that totally speaks to the why of this work, the why behind this work. This work it can be difficult. It can take a lot from the folks who are engaged in it, right? But it's all in an effort to try to improve the lives of real people who are going through real things, who are living in conditions that are beyond reason, right? And who are dealing with all of the injustices of the world, right? And the effects of our flawed systems and institutions. And so it's important, I think, for all of us to keep in mind why this work is important.
Absolutely.
Right. And we have to persist in it, as this piece says. So the whole conclusion of this piece was great application, I think, for all of us.
Yeah, persistence is key.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, now that we've talked about application, it's homework time. So what are we going to do to continue learning beyond our conversation today? I think my homework has got to be learning a little bit more about each of these organizations that the panelists represent here. So Working Families Party, Carolina Federation, Faith in Minnesota, and Worker Power are all doing work that we can clearly learn from because we have just from this article.
Yes.
They're all sort of creating and consolidating power with people, with the people. And by doing that, they're chipping away at the power that authoritarian or fascist, I think we can use that word, that the right think that they have. And as we move forward, that's an imperative. So I want to sort of learn more about what it is that they're doing, what it might look like, to translate that to the work that I find myself doing at times.
Yes, absolutely. I thought of that too. I really think these organizations, I'm going to name them again: Grassroots Power Project, Working Power, which they're based in Arizona, Faith in Minnesota, Carolina Federation, the Working Families Party, who you mentioned earlier, right? I think it's clear that they've all done some very important work, right? And have had some incredible victories in their work and also lessons learned in their work. And so I would love to see if there are other ways to sort of learn from them, amplify their work, support them. And so that's part of my homework. I also am just really a fan of The Forge. You've brought now a couple of pieces from them to the table, and they've been great. And so I'd love to, I don't think I did this before, so I want to poke around a little bit more in their website. Maybe I'll bring something next time from The Forge, but just see what other resources they have to offer us, because the two pieces that we've read have been phenomenal. So I want to keep them, bookmark them for sure.
Yeah, they have some great stuff throughout their site.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, Damien, you're up next time. What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Yes. All right. So for our next episode, I am going to bring a documentary to the table for us.
All right.
And it's actually one that's been out for a very long time. It is a classic. So I'm excited to bring it to the table for us. You and I have actually talked about this a number of times. So it's finally happening. We're bringing this documentary to the table. It is I Am Not Your Negro, which of course came out back in 2016, directed by the one and only Raoul Peck. So I'm super excited to hear his voice again in whatever way we can get it. It's all about and was based on James Baldwin's unpublished book, Remember This House. And so Raoul Peck uses it to showcase sort of how Baldwin explored race in the United States through his work and the work of other civil rights leaders of his time and in his lifetime.
All right.
So I'm thrilled to finally have some time in our schedule to bring this one to the table for us to talk about.
Awesome. Yeah, sounds great. I've been looking forward to, I think I watched that a few years ago now, but I don't remember what context that was in. I think it was just because.
Yeah.
So yeah, excited to see that again and talk about it here next week. All right. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today and for listening to Interdependent Study. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media. Check us out on YouTube. Sign up for our email list to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Yes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about us. We'll talk to you next week.